Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Nuclear Energy, What Does the Public Think? My name is Catherine Klein and I'm a technical advisor at NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation, where I support the nuclear energy partnership between the United States Department of Energy and NARUC. I'd like to welcome Commissioner Anthony O'Donnell, who will be moderating today's webinar. Commissioner O'Donnell is the chair of the NARUC Committee on Nuclear Issues Waste Disposal, and he's a member on the Committee of Electricity at NARUC. In 2021, he was elected president of the Mid-Atlantic Conference of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, also known as MACRUC. Commissioner O'Donnell was appointed to serve on the Maryland Public Service Commission in 2016 and reappointed in 2021. Prior to his time on the commission, he served on in the Maryland House of Delegates for 22 years. Commissioner O'Donnell has direct experience with nuclear, working at Calvert Cliff Nuclear Plant in Leslie, Maryland for 15 years, supporting safe and reliable electric power generation in various capacities. He started his career serving in the United States Navy. And with that, I'd like to invite Commissioner O'Donnell to please take it away.
Thank you, Catherine, for that very generous introduction, but the real subject matter experts will be presenting in a second. So on behalf of myself and my co-chair, Commissioner Tim Eccles from the Georgia Public Service Commission, thank you for joining the U.S. Department of Energy NARUC Nuclear Energy Partnership for today's webinar on nuclear energy. What does the public think? The Nuclear Energy Partnership provides opportunities for state and public service commissioners and commission staff to better understand barriers and opportunities related to the U.S. nuclear fleet. It also provides education and information to state commissioners and staff on important issues surrounding the use of nuclear energy technologies. Today's webinar will feature Dr. Kuhika Gupta from the Oklahoma University Institute for Public Research and Analysis. Also joining us from OU's Institute for Public Research and Analysis and available during the question session will be Dr. Hank Jenkins from the same group. Also, we will have John Marshall from Potential Energy Collective and Jackie Toth from the Good Energy Collective. Today's webinar is being recorded and the recording and slides will be posted on NARUC's website and emailed to attendees after the webinar. We thank the DOE Office of Nuclear Energy for their support of NARUC's research and technical assistance on nuclear energy issues. Please enter questions in the Q&A box at any time and we will get through as many as possible following the presentations. I'll briefly introduce today's speakers before they share their presentations. Dr. Kuhika Gupta is the Associate Director of Energy and Security at the University of Oklahoma's Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis. Her research focuses on the policy process and how social, political, and institutional factors influence policymaking. She studies multiple policy domains, including energy policy, environmental policy, and weather and climate policy. She has spent over a decade studying public perceptions regarding nuclear energy, as well as the factors that influence nuclear energy facility siting. From a global comparative perspective, she has led and managed several federally funded projects studying the public views about nuclear energy using multiple data streams, including surveys and social media. Dr. Hank Jenkins is of the same facility. He is a George Lynn Cross Research Professor in the Political Science Department at the University of Oklahoma and serves as the Director of the Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis and will be joining us in the question and answer session. John Marshall is the founder and CEO of Potential Energy Coalition. I may have said collective before. Potential Energy Coalition, a nonpartisan nonprofit coalition that brings together America's leading creative, analytic, and media agencies to shift the conversation on climate change. Mr. Marshall is also a professor of marketing at Dartmouth College and senior advisor to Lippincott. Prior to founding Potential Energy, Mr. Marshall had a long career as a senior marketing executive, as the chief strategy and innovations officer at Lippincott, global head of strategy and analytics at the digital agency Digitas, president of the public education company, the Princeton Review, and partner with the consulting firm Oliver Wyman. He now dedicates his time to using these marketing skills to address the climate crisis. Jackie Toth is Deputy Director of Good Energy Collective, a progressive research organization making the progressive case for nuclear energy to contribute towards a climate-constrained, equitable energy future. A former journalist from 2015 to 2019, Jackie reported on federal energy and environmental law and regulations for Congressional Quarterly Roll Call, CQ Roll Call, and Morning Consult. After, she led public opinion research and developed policy and communication strategies on nuclear energy and other technologies for the Climate and Energy Program at A Third Way, a DC-based think tank. Jackie holds a BA in International Studies and a minor in Linguistics from American University. First, we'll turn to Dr. Gupta.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell. And whenever you're ready with the slides, Catherine. I'm still seeing the main webinar slide and not my title slide. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Catherine. Good afternoon. I'm really excited to be here to share our research on public perceptions about nuclear energy technology. As Commissioner O'Donnell mentioned, I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Jenkins-Smith, and we're really excited to have this opportunity and look forward to the discussion. The talk today is going to focus on understanding public views about nuclear energy technology and what seems to matter. Next slide, please. So public views about nuclear energy technology shift over time. I'm going to show that in the next slide. But the question remains, what are some broad frameworks that can help us better understand these dynamics of opinion change? I'm going to discuss three main aspects of that question, starting with public support for existing nuclear energy technology. What are public views about existing nuclear energy technologies, and what are primary drivers of support and opposition among members of the public in the US? After that, I'm going to discuss a little bit about advanced nuclear energy technologies. Can advanced nuclear reactors help revive the role of nuclear in the US, comparing support for advanced to traditional reactor technologies, and exploring possible constituents for advanced reactors among different subgroups within members of the US public. And finally, touching on community-led decision-making. How can we connect community needs with energy choices? Communities, not countries, are increasingly making decisions about their energy sources, what their energy mix looks like. And so understanding variation in support for nuclear energy at the community level and providing communities the opportunity to participate and drive what their energy mix looks like is really important. And we've done some research into that, and I'm excited to present some of that today. Next slide, please. So beginning very big picture, what this graph is showing you is long-term public views on nuclear energy. And you see that black line in the center is showing overall support for nuclear energy beginning in the mid-1970s all the way up to 2021. And it's showing you overall, like I was saying before, that public support for nuclear energy has not stayed constant over time. In the 70s, you can see support was relatively high. It was above 75%, but it dipped tremendously even before 3 Mile Island happened, but definitely since then. And you can see that it continued to decline as Chernobyl accident happened. And you saw some resurgence in the 1990s, where some were beginning to call that a nuclear renaissance of sorts, but then with Fukushima, support fell again and is now in the 2021, 2020, beginning to maybe increase again. Each of the gray dots that you see here represent a single public opinion survey that was conducted in that year by different organizations. And then the red ones that are highlighted more on the right are surveys that we at the University of Oklahoma at our institute conduct and field every year, which we've done since 2006 up to 2022. And that's most of the data that I'm going to be presenting, bearing to the lessons that I'm going to highlight today. But the main point here is to show, three things. One, that public opinion is not consistent. It changes over time. Big accidents like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima clearly have a negative effect on public support. And what I'm not showing here, but we found in our research, is also a strong indication that energy security or the lack of energy security in the US drives support for support for nuclear energy. So in times when energy security is low or energy insecurity is high, that could be rising oil and gas prices, reduced imports of oil and gas, support for nuclear energy goes up. And then in times where energy security is high, we've seen a strong correlation that support for nuclear energy tends to decline. Next slide, please. And so when people are thinking about nuclear, they're not thinking often just nuclear in a vacuum. They're thinking about nuclear in relation to other energy sources that we use in the US. And so in our surveys, as I mentioned before, the energy and environment surveys that we do every year includes a question on people's preferred energy mix over the next 20 years. We ask respondents, we tell them, we currently get about X% from these different sources. And then we ask them, we want to know what percent of total US electricity supply over the next 20 years you would like to see from each of these. And the point I want to highlight here is that when it comes to nuclear, most people on average want the role of nuclear to remain somewhat stable as it is now. So if nuclear currently produces about 20% of total US electricity, on average, people want to see 16 to 18% given the year that we've asked that question. They do want to see a huge increase in reliance from solar, wind, and hydro, and a significant decline in reliance on fossil fuels. Next slide, please. And so then thinking about possible factors that can explain support for nuclear and why people are somewhat supportive but not overly optimistic about and don't want to see us increase our reliance on nuclear. We measure public perceptions about the risks and benefits of nuclear energy. And we measure that using 4 different indices that I'll describe in a second on the next slide. But overall, we know that risk and benefit perceptions account for most of the variation in support and opposition for nuclear. What's interesting, though, is that in our analysis, we found that they exert roughly the same impact, the push and pull in opposite directions. It's not that risk perceptions play a heavier role than benefit perceptions when it comes to explaining public support or opposition. Many people have high risk and high benefit perceptions. And so a large portion of the population is torn in their views about nuclear. And what that graph on the right is showing you is that 53% of our respondents are in that top right quadrant, where they have high risk and high benefit perceptions when it comes to nuclear energy. You see that on the left of that, 20% of respondents are in that quadrant where they have high benefit perceptions, but low risk perceptions. And then on the bottom right, you see that 10% of respondents have high risk, but low benefit perceptions. The point here really just is to show that people are torn, and most people tend to think of nuclear as a high benefit and a high risk technology. Next slide, please. And so breaking down the risk and benefit perceptions to its component parts, as I was saying before, we track different aspects of risk and different aspects of benefit of nuclear. And people weigh these when they're making, formulating their opinions about nuclear. And what we find is that fear of an accident at a nuclear power plant has the largest negative impact on support. But viewing nuclear power as a reliable source of electricity, as you can see, that coefficient of reliable power is significantly above even that accident. So the promise of reliable power that comes with nuclear exerts a very big positive impact on support for nuclear. Notice here on the bottom column for the benefits that environmental damage and greenhouse gases don't seem to have a similar impact. So I'm going to present a little bit in the next couple slides that relationship between beliefs about climate and the role of nuclear. Next slide, please. And so getting into now the advanced reactor technologies and how they compare to traditional and the promise that they might hold. This slide is showing you a graph where we track since 2006 in the gray and black lines, track how people feel about constructing additional nuclear reactors at existing power plants in the US, additional nuclear power plants at new locations. And as you can see, that support for those traditional reactor constructions was relatively high, above 50% before Fukushima happened. And that dip that you see in 2010 and 2011 is largely because of Fukushima. And then after that, support dipped below 50 and kind of stayed below that dotted 50% line until recently, when, as we saw in the long-term plot, support began to come back above that 50% line. And what you see in the blue dot line is support that we've tracked since 2015, a similar question about how people feel about constructing small modular reactors to generate electricity in the US. And as you can see, support is significantly higher and has remained significantly higher for small modular and other advanced reactor technologies, with most recently in 2021 and 2022 support as high as 75% among people that have an opinion about it. Next slide, please. So begs the question, why? What are some subgroups in the American population that we can look at to help explain and tease out some of these differences? And so I'm going to present 3 of those subgroups here, beginning with generations. So when we think about different age groups, do we see differences, and what kind of differences do we find? So what this is showing you here is going from silent generation to Generation Z. When you look at traditional reactor technologies, there's a negative relationship between support for nuclear and age, as a positive relationship. As age goes up, support goes up. So the older generations are significantly more supportive of traditional reactor technologies than younger generations. You don't see that, interestingly, in our data. We don't find that same relationship when it comes to new nuclear technologies. As you can see, support for SMRs is more consistent across generation, and even young people are drawn to the innovation and new technology that comes with advanced reactor technologies. Next slide, please. Moving now to look at some partisan views. So this graph is showing you a similar setup for party identification. So moving from strong Democrat to strong Republican, we find that there is a huge effect when it comes to traditional reactor technologies, where as you move from strong Democrat to strong Republican, support for nuclear energy increases significantly. Again, we see some opportunities for advanced reactors to break that trend. Support for SMRs seems to be much more consistent across partisan groups, and there seems to be substantial support even among Democrats in the data that we've collected so far, at least. Next slide, please. Finally, looking at beliefs about climate change and how that might influence people's opinion about nuclear. What you see is on the x-axis, concern about climate change going from very low to very high, and on the y-axis, public support. And we've tracked this every year. I'm showing data from 2021, but we've seen this as a very consistent negative relationship between concern for climate change and support for nuclear, all the way from 2006 to 2022, where those who are more concerned about climate change are significantly less supportive of nuclear energy technologies. But again, when it comes to advanced reactor technologies, things seem to be different. Support for SMR seems to be more consistent, and there's substantial support even among those who worry about climate change. Next slide, please. Right, up until now, I've really talked about public opinion and public perceptions at this broad national scale. I want to take a minute to make sure that we talk and think about variation in support. Support is not consistent across the country as a whole. And so in one of our projects, we took all of the energy and environment data that we've collected over time and mapped that at a state and county level. I'm not going to go into this very much, but just to show that there is significant variation in support, perceived risk, and perceived benefit across states and counties, and that we believe is really important to recognize as communities begin having conversations with technology developers and perhaps utilities to figure out if nuclear is a good fit for their community. Next slide, please. And this is a tool that we've developed. It's free to use. It's called Planet. I'm happy to provide the link to the tool, but you can go in and download data for the analysis I was just describing and look at any county in any state and compare those. And so I hope this is useful, and I wanted to make sure that everybody knows about this resource. Next slide, please. Great, this is my final slide. I'm not gonna belabor the points too much, but just that public opinion is dynamic and it shifts over time. And while the future of nuclear energy is undecided, we found in our analysis that advanced reactors do display potential, but that engaging potential host communities early and enabling positive narratives is crucial in helping change perhaps the future of nuclear energy and its use in the US. That's all.
Thank you, Doctor. Appreciate it. Now we'll go to John Marshall. John, take it away.
Thanks, Commissioner O'Donnell. I'm excited to be here. We at Potential Energy we're basically a nonprofit marketing firm that's trying to understand where the public is on the clean energy and the climate transition. And we do a fairly significant amount of research and a lot of message testing as to which messages actually educate the public best. And then we subsequently design campaigns against those opportunities. We got very interested in perceptions of nuclear power in coal communities. In particularly, we were interested in the energy communities who may be candidates for new nuclear build. And so we did a fairly large scale study at places where either coal facilities had closed or were slated for closure to understand public opinion with respect to nuclear power. And so if we go to the next slide, I'll share 5 insights that we got from that research. This was a This was a fairly large scale piece of work across hundreds of communities with a sample size of about 9,000 Americans across all ages and political persuasions. But the one thing that they had in common is they lived in America's energy communities, particularly America's coal energy communities. And we were looking to address 4 questions. How strong is local support in these communities for nuclear? How broad is that support? To what extent can it be influenced? And what kind of messaging resonates most with members of those communities? So if you go to the next slide, I'll share the first point here. A lot of data on the slide, but the overall message is that both nationally, but also in these communities, support for nuclear significantly outweighs opposition. And so if you see the big yellow bar here, 52% of Americans actually support new nuclear facilities. In coal communities, that support actually is 5% higher than national support. So local communities, which are America's energy communities who are skilled and equipped to deliver power to the grid, are actually more supportive of nuclear as a solution than even nationally. And that's a 5-to-1 ratio, five support for 1 opposition, and only 12% are against that. So when you go into the places that are potentially the most likely, like the Kemmerer, Wyomings and others, to look at new nuclear opportunities, the support is fairly large, and it's also it's larger on the conservative side, which echoes the data that we just saw. But we see that we don't see as much drop off on the more liberal political affiliation. If you go to the next slide, I'll give you a little bit more detail on that, because I think there's something very interesting about political values here. What we have seen is a U-shaped curve, and we agree that support for nuclear is larger for people who hold more conservative values, but we actually see it being reasonably high for people who hold what they describe as very liberal values. Where it's weakest is in the moderate or to the middle of the road. So we see this unique U-shape, one of the few places in America where we have alignment between the far right and the far left. And that's true both on support for nuclear as well as knowledge for nuclear. Very conservative and very liberal people are both self-report as being much more knowledgeable about the category, but they both also self-report as being more supportive of nuclear power. Why is that? Let's go to the next page. This is one of the most interesting findings from our research, that education on the issue is significantly correlated to support for nuclear. And so on the left-hand side, on the vertical axis, you see the percentage who strongly support nuclear energy use. And on the horizontal, you see the degree of self-reported knowledge about the category. So the 8% of people in these communities who describe themselves as not very knowledgeable had less than 10% support. But the folks who are extremely knowledgeable or self-report as extremely knowledgeable had 76% support. And so this is one particular unique facet. And we've tested hundreds of different messages against different clean energy technologies. And we found that when you educate people on nuclear, they tend to move much more than other technologies. But we've also found the baseline of knowledge to be fairly low and there to be significant headroom to educate audiences. Only 15% of these communities describe themselves as highly knowledgeable about nuclear power, and only 7% of the least supportive audience, moderates, describe themselves as highly knowledgeable. In fact, only 37% of community members even know where their energy comes from. I'll also say that and this piece of data isn't on the slide, but I think is important, that the misperceptions around the nuclear category from our data are fairly significant. In America, only 29% of people describe nuclear as a clean source of energy. And so we have definitely found that the right educational messaging actually changes the nature of how people see the category, more so than any of the other research that we've done. So let me take you to the third point here on the next page. This is an experiment, basically a message design experiment, where we have a baseline of support for nuclear, and then we have an educational message, and we look at the extent to which support for nuclear changes. And so on the left-hand side, 55% of America, or in these communities, Americans in these communities, support nuclear energy use. When you give them an educational message, that goes up by 12% to 67%. And a similar phenomenon happens in support for nuclear in coal communities and support in people's particular counties, you see a double-digit increase. For other clean energy technologies that we've looked at, we typically will see a 3 to 4 to 5% increase. And so the degree of educational opportunity around nuclear seems to be relatively high, but also the baselines are relatively low. So let me go to the final page here. What we did in our work was we explored a whole series of messages and how those messages actually impact support for nuclear. And the three things that come out consistently, and the one at the top in particular, which is the highest performing message, are energy independence, nuclear innovation, but also it's a clean energy source that addresses climate change. Our view of this data, which is relatively new, it's about 6 months old, is we're in kind of a unique time frame where there are sort of three things that are happening in the world. We've certainly had an increased recognition of the climate crisis. The number of people who are alarmed about climate change has doubled over the course of the last 10 years from the Yale Center for Climate Communications data. And so climate has been a factor that's changed the context. Secondly, the global energy crisis has really increased people's desire for low-cost energy sources that are homegrown. And the third thing, which also echoes the Oklahoma data, is new technology breakthroughs are opening people's eyes to this. We also have seen that small modular reactors have caused a significant increased interest, particularly on the left, but overall in nuclear as an energy solution. So that concludes my comments, and happy to take questions later in the session.
Thank you, John. Very interesting. We appreciate it. And now we will go to Jackie Toth. Jackie, take it away.
Thanks, Commissioner. It's so nice to be here with you all today. Big thank you to NARUC for the return invitation to another one of these good conversations. Thank you all for joining us so close to the holidays. Just a quick word of introduction to Good Energy Collective. Next slide, please. We advance community-centered, equity-focused policy for nuclear energy to contribute toward our national climate response. And so as many of you know from past webinars in this nuclear energy partnership series, the nuclear energy advocacy community has had a lot of success out of its work on advanced nuclear innovation over the years. We now have the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, the HALEU Availability Program, making sure we're developing the infrastructure domestically to produce the fuels that we need for new nuclear, and many other steps. And in the Inflation Reduction Act, we now have incentives to support real investments in advanced nuclear. But before we founded in 2020, there wasn't an organization focused specifically on developing social policy in tandem for new nuclear, to ensure that we're taking the steps to understand what the public's questions and concerns continue to be around these technologies. And as Kuhika rightly emphasized, to enable communities to have a say in their energy future, as well as to help nuclear developers and utilities understand how they can make sure they're putting their best foot forward in these early localized conversations to set the stage for future advanced nuclear deployments. So on these public perception questions, we've just heard from Kuhika and John, who are doing really fantastic work at, figuring out how do different demographic groups continue to think about nuclear? What concerns do they still harbor about the technology that will crop up in public meetings held by developers or utility commissions? I'm going to spend a brief moment talking about what we see in external and internal polling in this area, and then move into some of the implications for what policies we think could help meaningfully address social concerns about nuclear and support some local early engagements, and what the implications might be for utility commissions of increased utility and investor interest in advanced reactors. Next slide, please. So Kuhika covered this expertly, that simply asking how people feel point blank about nuclear for many years now, you see it stand around 1 in 2 Americans in support. As recently as June, Reuters and Ipsos had done some polling on this question, found support standing around 45%, which is lower than you see for many other energy technologies. Next slide. But in polling that we collaborated on with the progressive polling and policy organization Data for Progress last March, we asked over 1,200 likely voters nationwide online about their support for federal investments in new advanced reactors in light of the anticipated benefits that these technologies are found to have. And support stood at about 72%, which is quite high. Next slide, please. As John has said, just hearing about what advanced nuclear energy can offer, greater safety, reduced cost, greater efficiency, and like today's reactors, no operating emissions, you see support for nuclear grow. After just asking respondents some questions about advanced nuclear that expose them both to the benefits of the technology, but also to some of the commonly held concerns around health and safety and waste, we saw a 17-point increase in favorability toward advanced nuclear by the end of the poll compared to pre-messaging. So that's a jump from a plurality of 41% to a comfortable majority of 58%. And this starts to suggest that for states and communities that NARUC members serve, opinions on advanced nuclear energy are not yet set in stone. The more folks hear about the technology, the more they tend to like it, at least in the abstract. But still, among energy technologies, nuclear does carry some unique and significant risk perception issues, concerns about legacy pollution, as we heard already this morning, the three big accidents, a lack of a good story about what we're going to do with the waste, that will continue to weigh on folks' favorability toward nuclear getting sited within their community. So policymakers and regulators need to work to earn an increase in public trust at the macro and micro level by being responsive to their inquiries and making sure that we're incorporating public input into the policymaking and decision-making process around whether and where to site new reactors. And this is important because the first few advanced reactor projects in the US, if they can show clear community support and excitement, that'll go a long way toward encouraging additional builds and relieving some of the pressure on regulators and commissions who can see these technologies in action. But it's important that we start working to identify and engage towns and counties and areas beyond the first few demonstration projects now. Next slide, please. So there are some federal programs or supported projects that are either already underway or at a minimum already authorized to support this type of work. I'll just take some of these in turn as folks have interest. Just last week, the Nuclear Energy Office at the Energy Department announced the awardees under a first-of-a-kind community engagement award fund to support some local engagement at a value of $800,000. So this is exciting to see them doing this and focusing specifically on questions of environmental and energy justice. Likewise, we have the annual Nuclear Energy University Program Awards, through which DOE supports R&D at the universities, and often with the labs, into mission critical issues. This was the first year this past cycle that NE funded 3 different projects that focus on social science research, projects happening out in Alaska and Wyoming, and Kuhika is leading a third at the University of Oklahoma. So we're excited about that and hope to see that kind of support for social science research continue. DOE is also working with a handful of communities and utilities with retiring coal plants to explore opportunities for repowering those coal facilities with small modular reactors. As we just heard from John, support is likely to be even higher in these areas. We see that 5-point premium of support in those communities, and it would be an important way to support a just transition for energy communities. Good Energy released a report on this topic last December. In the bipartisan infrastructure law, Congress also told DOE to start supporting feasibility studies into using small modular reactors and microreactors in grid isolated communities, and importantly, to conduct robust public engagement and participation prior to providing awards. The directive carries no authorization or funding, however, so we hope to see that remedied soon. Similarly, in the CHIPS and Science Law enacted this year, the big microchip and National Science Foundation and lab legislation, that included $800 million over 5 years for R&D projects on advanced nuclear for entities to apply for, with priority given to projects that take place in or near the areas of retiring fossil fuel facilities. So hope to see that project appropriated for soon. One of the big questions that comes up is always on nuclear waste. You can talk more about this if there's interest, but the Biden administration is working toward an innovative approach to addressing the nuclear waste storage issue at the moment. And at the state level, I mean, folks on this call will know better than most, there's a lot of action going on these days, not just around some states taking action to lift bans or restrictions on new nuclear plant builds, but also importantly around exploring the feasibility of nuclear for the state and hopefully having lots of local conversations as part of that effort. Lots of bills in the legislatures have been introduced or enacted to do this. Commissioner, I believe your state energy administration is also providing some support to a developer and a university to look into potentially repowering a coal plant in Maryland with a nuclear reactor. So getting that kind of feasibility process underway, talking with towns and counties that might co-develop the project is important. Next slide. So what are the implications of all of this at the state level? What can utility commissions be doing now to prepare? And what can you expect to encounter in the coming years as these conversations heat up? It's going to depend on the state or the marketplace at hand, but in all cases, proactivity around planning for the likelihood of advanced reactor buildouts is called for. And that means doing some research now, talking to these new nuclear reactor developers, talking to the Office of Nuclear Energy at DOE, to the folks involved in the Nuclear Energy Partnership at NARUC, and start understanding the timelines to deployment and thinking about the siting and permitting requirements for new reactors. Some of these reactors, for example, quite possibly will have their emergency planning zones reduced to the fence line of the plant, unlike traditional reactors, which could have positive implications, right, for repowering, retiring fossil generation, leveraging existing transmission assets, but might also raise some local questions about preparedness, since today nuclear communities receive emergency response funding support for a set radius around the plants. For states that are part of an RTO, there's a different conversation around if we want nuclear energy to be part of a state's portfolio, advanced nuclear in particular, should the marketplace be incenting that? And anticipating that it may be a good plan in the near term for commissions to hold town halls or public meetings around specific projects or the concept of advanced nuclear in the state in general to start engaging what we would expect would be a more engaged and interested audience around this technology. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Jackie. So our panelists have given us a fascinating presentation or set of presentations with regard to what the public thinks, and that's essential for us. In a free market economy, in a constitutional republic or democracy, it's everything. You know, we can be as smart as we want on the technological side, but if we don't engage and have the support of the public, these opportunities may never come to fruition or may develop very large opposition. So having said that, we're going to move into our Q&A portion of the webinar. And so I'm going to throw out a few questions. And if anybody else would like to chime in, please feel free on the panel. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. Okay, John, I'm going to ask you a question. Even the phrase nuclear reactor has a specific and sometimes negative connotation to it for parts of the public, and there are other terms that you have found to create a more positive association. How are nuclear supporters approaching naming conventions for advanced nuclear to differentiate it from the existing technologies?
It's a great question. I don't know that we know the answer definitively. We have research underway, but we have some clues on this. I think whenever there are new technologies available, there is a benefit, you know, to using words that anchor people on new benefits that are provided. And so we've certainly found that using language around newer technologies increases comprehension and support for nuclear. In particular, this is just data that's come in this week, putting the word clean next to any naming convention about the nuclear category makes a significant difference in favorability, and it happens to be one of the bigger misperceptions. I don't know if Hank and the Oklahoma team have more studies on reactor versus power source and so forth. We found that nuclear as a word is relatively neutral. Atomic in our research has actually got more negatives associated with it. Reactor, we found a little more negative than positive. Energy source or plant maybe on the other side, but I'm happy to toss it over to the other folks who've got a few more decades of research on this, if there's anything you have to add.
John, you made really good points. I think one of the things that we've studied about every 3 or 4 years, we do a deep dive on the way people think about the attributes of different energy sources. And so we look for the ways people's sort of mental snapshot for solar, wind, coal, gas, oil, nuclear, all fare. And one of the things that is a significant challenge for us is that amongst the attributes for nuclear, it's seen as an old technology. Old, it's not as dirty in people's minds as is coal or oil. But it's still not at all in the category of solar and wind in people's minds in that domain. That's why when you attach the name clean to it, you sort of short circuit that reservoir of perceptions that have grown up over time about these energy technologies. We also think that that's why we're seeing this big gap between SMRs and other advanced reactor technologies and nuclear technologies in people's minds, and that goes right back to Commissioner O'Donnell's question, which is the way we describe these technologies evokes different attributes. I would caution that when we engage in messaging or naming contests, it's not a one-sided fight. The people who are critical of nuclear technologies are going to be out there with their own messaging and their own struggles. And so it's really critical in this process not to do anything that could be characterized as the kind of deceptions that nuclear critics like to point to when we talked about nuclear energy as too cheap to meter and all the early days of back in the 50s. All of that is a challenge for us. And so as we move forward, describing clean, making clear what we mean by clean, it doesn't mean we do away with the back end of the fuel cycle. It does mean that we, in the process of producing energy, are not spewing carbon into the atmosphere. And perhaps even thinking about alternative words, production clean, or other ways of making it clear that we're not making arguments that can't be sustained.
Very good, thank you. We have a question in the chat box that I think is a natural addendum to the question we just asked, which is this. It comes from John Christian. Large reactors will be critical for deep decarbonization, especially in advanced countries with advanced energy infrastructure. As we communicate the safety of SMRs, do we risk making large reactors or legacy reactors incorrectly unsafe? And I'll throw that out to anybody who wants to tackle it.
Well, I'll jump in. Well, go ahead, John.
Okay, go ahead. No, you first. You probably got data on this. I have a view, but not data. So why don't you lead?
It is a challenge for us, and that's in large part because what in the public mind are seen as traditional reactors have a mental imagery associated with them that entangles them with in popular culture and in the history of accidents with threats, with radiation, with the potential for reactor accidents, and I think we have to really be upfront about the safety of these plants. We don't hear enough about safety and per kilowatt hour and the comparison across the different types of energy that are out there. And our large reactors have an amazing track record, and it's very difficult to convey because we run headlong into the Simpsons and the other sort of popular culture tracks that attempt to highlight all of the downsides. But John, please take it away from there.
Yeah, I don't have data on this. I would say in other categories, communicating new benefits can accrue to the whole category. And I think nuclear has been under-communicated, if I had to say, over the last few decades. It's been a strong, steady, reliable source of power for the American grid. And to tell a story about innovation, which might get exemplified by SMRs and other technologies, my hypothesis is that that will bring attention to attributes that all nuclear technologies share, like cleanliness, reliability, and the ability to create energy in your home country. And so I don't necessarily think that the general public is really paying a deep sense of attention to what generation the technology is and so forth, and they're not thinking about it very much. So to the extent that there's a story about technology advances that may be embodied with SMRs, there are also technology advances in other generation facilities that can be encapsulated with that, and those are advances about safety and reliability. And so I'm not sure it's one necessarily has to have one technology win at the expense of another. And I think the category benefits are misunderstood and under-communicated in the first place.
Jackie or Kuhika, you got anything to opine on this?
Agree with both John and Hank. Great points.
Okay, thank you. We have another question in the Q&A box, and it comes from Zach Van Horn. Is there a perception, and John, you gave the deepest presentation on this, I think, but I could be wrong on that. Is there a perception that nuclear is a conservative technology that drives people concerned about climate change to be more skeptical that nuclear can be part of the solution?
Yeah, well, I was comparing in my mind the data from Dr. Gupta to the data that I was sharing, and I think, our sample sizes were more in energy communities than the total American public. We are seeing an increase over time among progressives. Now, these are in certain communities, so we're seeing that a little bit higher than what I saw in the other data. And so I think in general, there is a perception that it has been a more conservative technology. I think that flowed through both data sources, but there's a big change in the context. You've got tens of thousands of corporations with net zero commitments that are really hard to meet. You've got the Inflation Reduction Act changing the economics of a lot of energy. You've got, a significantly rising consciousness across political parties about the devastating potential impacts from climate. And so I think you are seeing an awakening on the left that this, especially with younger people, that this may be an increasingly important climate solution. I think that's a bit of a technology story. And I think younger generations tend to lean in to technology solutions, and that's the way they've been growing up. And so I really love seeing that in your data, Dr. Gupta, that younger people didn't necessarily have that polarization. And so my expectation is that there will be a growing support among progressives for nuclear technology, given that there's a growing awakening of the challenges that are meeting our net zero commitments. So that's a forecast, which is always kind of hazardous, but we're seeing a little bit of that in our data.
I went to a 3-day short course at MIT, and I was amazed at the level at their nuclear engineering school, and I was amazed at the level of support amongst some of the more progressive academics for understanding this issue as well. So
just
Jackie,
to add to that,
okay,
just one quick thing. In walking around COP27 in Egypt, there were a lot of young kids with Atoms for Climate shirts wandering around, and so it felt like there was and that's an international crowd. It felt like that was a thing that was growing, and it's always a leading indicator of what might be happening. Yeah,
Jackie, this is in your wheelhouse, so go ahead.
Yeah, and I recognize the question is more one of perception than in practice. But speaking from a policy standpoint, it really hasn't been borne out that it is, strictly speaking, a conservatively supported technology. Two big pieces of legislation, the Nuclear Energy Innovation Capabilities Act, the Nuclear Energy Innovation Modernization Act, both enacted in the last 3 or 4 years or so, were both either unanimously approved in the House or by incredible margins of support. Some of the biggest champions in Congress in recent years on nuclear energy have been Democrats. That's been the case both in the Senate, where you have Senators Whitehouse and Booker and others, Senator Coons, very forward-leaning, but also in the House. The Nuclear Energy Leadership Act, which was the first bill that included the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, which was eventually enacted at the end of 2020, was introduced by former Representative Elaine Luria, a Democrat representing Virginia Beach. To all of your points, progressives have not been as engaged in nuclear policy discourses over the years, which we think is a problem and a hindrance to these projects continuing to succeed, making sure that they have good community practices, elaborated stakeholder engagement, attention to energy justice issues, which should broaden support at the public level. So that's what we're working on.
Well, very good. Thank you for that. And Kuhika or Hank, give us the academic perspective on the question, if you would. What do you think?
Yeah, I can jump in, and I know Hank has a lot of background on this, so please hop in also, Hank. But it's really interesting. This is a very important question, one we talk about often, because historically, nuclear energy was just disconnected from the environmental movement in a way that led environmentalists who were most concerned about the climate and protecting our earth and being mindful, viewed nuclear as a dangerous technology. And we still see that. We still see remnants of that in our data that we collect. What's interesting is when we look at, again, trends by year for by ideology and support for nuclear, it's not so much that it's becoming a more conservative, it's more that it's becoming flatter, like I was showing, that support for nuclear is rising amongst some of those people, especially stronger liberals, because of these new technologies among younger people, climate change becoming a bit more real amongst those populations, and it really becoming this idea of nuclear was something we never thought about or thought was too big, bulky, dangerous, not safe for the environment. But hopefully as messaging increases and as some of these party elites and their messaging trickles down, I hope to see that support bump up even more amongst liberals. But Hank?
Kuhi, you got it dead right. I think the only addition I would make to this is that in the historical evolution of the nuclear debate, one of the issues from the left has been concern about proliferation and misuse of nuclear materials that come out of the back end of the fuel cycle for terrorist or nuclear proliferation purposes. And that coalition, the Union of Concerned Scientists and the other key players in the non-proliferation environment have persistently viewed nuclear as an energy source askance, because they thought that more reliance there would create problems in the international security environment. I think that in many instances, the Good Energy, for example, has done a really good job of reaching across to people who are in that domain to try to build bridges to essentially take advantage of potential agreements as opposed to disagreements. And that will help. But back to John's early point, we are at a turning point here. And I mean, I would join John in forecasting that we're going to see some differences here with the mix of things that are going on. It's not really clear how that's going to play out. I mean, with the Ukraine situation and the nuclear plant in the middle of that and the threats from Russia, the word nuclear is back in the news. I mean, we track it, and it's not all good.
Well, thank you all for that. And I know in 2016, when I went to the Maryland Public Service Commission, there was no discussion there about nuclear, even though nuclear power provides about 80% of Maryland's emission-free generation and 60% of our generation overall, give or take. And I said to myself, something's not right. Everybody's talking about wind and solar, which is important, and retiring coal discussions nobody's talking about nuclear, and I knew what my niche was going to be with my commissioner hat on. But having said that, we're running out of time, and it's a fascinating discussion. I'm going to have to wrap it up. I could talk about this stuff all day long, but I want to give a thank you to Jackie and John and Kuhika and Hank for your time today, and thank you to the Department of Energy Office of Nuclear Energy for supporting this webinar. Registration is open for the NARUC Winter Policy Summit taking place in Washington, D.C., always a good time, on February 12th through the 15th, and it's very informative, very informative. You can find the registration link and agenda on the NARUC website. The Subcommittee on Nuclear Issues Waste Disposal will have time set aside during the meeting, and Kira Zillman and Catherine Klein will share the agenda as soon as they work to confirm the speakers. Check NARUC's website for information on other upcoming activities, and please reach out to Kira and Catherine at NARUC with any questions or feedback. Thank you all, and have a great holiday coming up.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yep. Happy holidays. Bye-bye.